My name is Andrea Stoner Leaman. I'm program manager here at Safe Communities. Based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, our vision is communities where all children and teens are free from sexual abuse and survivors are empowered to live healthy, joyful, and vibrant lives. Please visit our website, safecommunitiespa.org, to learn about our day retreats for survivors, virtual circles of hope, as well as our educational programs for children, churches, and organizations. Due to a current grant, most of this programming is at no cost at this time, so we hope you will be able to use it. I want to draw special attention to our upcoming retreat for adult survivors of child sexual abuse called Journey with Tamar. It will be held on Saturday, May 15 at Branch Network, which is in the Ridgeview Mennonite Church building in Gordonville, which is in eastern Lancaster County. All survivors are welcome, and a little later I'll put the registration and information link in the chat. All chat messages will go to me, so if you're having any technical issues, don't hesitate to message me. And also all questions can be entered into the chat at any time. And at the end, I'll read a selection to Lynn. If you think of something while she's talking, feel free to go ahead and type it in there. This is being recorded, but know that your video boxes will not show up on that. It's up to you if you want to have your video on or off. I know as a speaker, it's always nice to be looking at a few faces, but that is your choice. The link to the recording will be sent out to the registrants by Thursday. We're so grateful that you've chosen to be a part of this evening to listen and learn from Lyn Barrett's experience as a survivor diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. This is the fourth interview in our Survivor Voices series. The purpose of the series is to educate the public about the issue of child sexual abuse and what it means to seek justice as an adult, provide survivors who are ready to be public with a safe platform to speak, and inspire survivors in the listening audience to take steps towards healing and justice. Our stories are precious and valuable. It is a gift to be offered them and an honor to listen. Here is Lyn Barrett and Safe Communities Director, Linda Crockett.
So thank you, Andrea. So it's good to see y'all here tonight. Our guest is, of course, Lyn Barrett, who is an author, speaker, retreat leader, and a survivor of early childhood trauma, who was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, or DID, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. Professionally, Lyn was an elementary school teacher, a school principal, and a church pastor. She graduated from Lancaster Theological Seminary in 2004 and served at St. Luke's UCC in Lidditz and First Congregational Church in Woodbury, Connecticut. So I got to know Lyn as a colleague and a friend during her time in Lancaster. And when in 2020, she asked me to write the foreword for her forthcoming memoir, tentatively titled Crazy, in Search of a Narrative, I felt so honored because this is an important story. It helps to deconstruct the myth that we must remember exactly what happened to us before we can accept the deeper truth that our traumatized bodies and minds are trying to convey to us. That detailed narrative memory is the prize standard in our culture for truth. But we know through the work of Dr. Bessel van der Kolk and other pioneers in the field of trauma that our bodies do indeed keep the score, as his book is titled. And that trauma memories often don't reside in our cognitive brains, but in dissociated fragments that seem to burst through into our awareness out of nowhere. With DID, some of those fragments can take on distinct personalities and roles. So Lyn's story and her recent work as an advocate for dissociative survivors, which we'll talk about tonight, helps us more fully grasp how recurring childhood sexual trauma can be deeply hidden from our consciousness, and that the deeper truth of what happened can be discovered and healed, even when cognitive narrative remains elusive. So Lyn, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, for having me here. And I know that the people who are out there listening are probably from all around the country. Some of them are. And but I still feel like my heart is in Lancaster County. I've left a little bit of it. So it's so nice to be here with you and Andrea and all the others from central Pennsylvania, as well as with people from around the country. So thank you.
That's beautiful. Thank you. So let's jump in with both feet, shall we?
We'll try.
So I wonder, could we begin by my just asking about the general background of your family as you grew up? You know, what were your parents like? What was your social, religious, kind of intellectual landscape of your family? Just some background about that.
Sure. Well, I'll share some of what I remember. My father was an electrician. He was an atheist. He was a very well-read man and really brilliant. But they tell me that he never got past 6th grade because he couldn't handle the structure of school and he rebelled. He was verbally and emotionally abusive to my mother. As far as I know, he was not physically abusive. What I saw was verbal and emotional. My mother was a stay-at-home mom, and she was a very talented artist that blossomed in her midlife. And I suspect, in part at least, to help her through the depression that she felt off and on through her life. My mother and my father, my older sister, who was 4 years older than me, and my 8 years younger brother, lived in a 2nd floor apartment in a building that my father had purchased on a very busy commercial street just outside of Philadelphia. And we were a really isolated family grouping, even though as children we had friends, and my parents certainly had acquaintances in the neighborhood. They never socialized. And we were just sort of inward, and my father was extremely controlling. We didn't go to church like other people went to church. We didn't have family rituals like other people did. We didn't go on vacations. But that was just life, because, you know, when you're a little child, you don't know the difference. I mentioned that my father was an atheist. My mother was an agnostic. And I share that because that's kind of important towards the end of the story. But I don't remember a whole lot of detail of my childhood. I remember some, but it wasn't a particularly happy childhood that I can recall. They tell me that I used to hold on to my mother's coat tails and hide behind her when I was around people when I was 2 and 3 years old. So.
Yeah, well, that helps to paint kind of the landscape for us a little bit. So thank you for kind of sharing that kind of glimpse of what your family of origin was like. You know, it could be really helpful, I think, to the people that are listening to learn a bit more about DID before you share some of your experiences. You know, sometimes people have in mind the very dramatic kinds of presentations of multiple personality disorders that have been made famous by Hollywood. So, I mean, I wonder, could you just give us a very basic definition of what DID is and kind of how alders come to be, and how does your brain create them? Just to give us a basic primer.
Sure. Well, let me start by explaining the word dissociation. Everybody dissociates. Dissociation is when our mind disconnects from our bodies or our surroundings. And that might happen just because we're bored. If we're sitting in a lecture hall and we aren't enjoying what we're hearing, we're looking out the window and we're thinking of other things. So boredom can cause dissociation. Stress can cause dissociation. The reality is that trauma can also cause dissociation. So there, and all of that is on a continuum. But when dissociation becomes a real a problem for individuals, it usually has become some kind of a disorder. There are actually 5 different dissociative disorders, and dissociative identity disorder is the most extreme, the most well-known, and the most misunderstood. So I would actually like to read from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, just the very, very first part, so you can hear what dissociative identity disorder is. It's the disruption of identity characterized by 2 or more distinct personality states. The disruption in identity involves marked discontinuity in sense of self and sense of agency, accompanied by related alterations in emotions, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, and so on. There's always some form of amnesia that comes with dissociative identity disorder. That could be amnesia between the parts that we create. It could be amnesia of a particular period of time, or amnesia of traumatic events. It could be all of those or a few of those, but you will always find amnesia of some sort involved in DID. I'd also just mention that DID is almost always caused by chronic trauma in the child under 6 years old. So there are cases where children will develop it because of really severe medical interventions, or in the cases of war, but it is almost always caused by abuse or significant trauma in the young child's life.
So most people think that DID is really rare. Is that true? Is it all that rare?
No, actually, it's that we did think it was rare. I probably thought it was rare and very unusual, but over the past 30 years, there's been so much research into DID, and it is experts are now saying that anywhere between 1% and 3% of the population has DID, because it's a really natural response of the child's brain to chronic trauma. So yeah, in the United States, that means that almost 4 million people probably are suffering from DID. And it's also supposed to be very underreported. For instance, I was in the system for almost 10 years before I was correctly diagnosed.
Yeah,
So,
and I imagine it's often underdiagnosed as well.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
a lot of clinicians are not skilled in being able to diagnose it.
Yeah.
So I would think that's also part of the issue. Yeah. So you begin your memoir, which I cannot wait to see published, by writing, it was somewhere between my 34th and 39th year when I began to go crazy. At that point, you were married to a man you loved. You had 4 lively young children, and you lived in what you called the yellow brick house in a leafy residential suburb. It sounded pretty idyllic. It really did. So your husband at the time, who was your ex-husband, John, was teaching, and you were a stay-at-home mom who loved taking care of her children. But so you're living that seemingly like perfect life, at least from the outside, but then things began to fall apart for you. So I wonder if you could read just a short passage in your memoir that kind of describes what this time was like for you.
Thank you for asking me to do that, and I'll be happy to. I would just preface that by saying that I created this really, really happy life out of always having felt defective, but never knowing I had parts. And so I was just loving my life, loving it with everything I had.
Yeah.
And then it started to fall apart. And this is the piece that you wanted me to read. So it's called Coming Undone. It actually is just taken out of my journal, but I've given it a name.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is something I wrote in my journal. I'm beginning to wonder if I'm crazy, if the world I know is real. I'm beginning to doubt my own perception of reality. I'm very confused. My thinking and my feeling don't match. I have to rely on my thinking mode because my feeling mode is too painful. Then when things get stressful, my thinking gives way and I have to rely on my feelings, and that is just too painful. Every time someone or something hurts me, it's affirmation of my worthlessness. Last week, I saw my face in a restaurant mirror and I was dead. It was my dead face. I am either worthless or insane. If I can fall completely into my feelings, then maybe I can let go. Maybe I can die.
So you saw yourself in a mirror and it was your dead face. It was your dead face. And at this point, you didn't realize you were GID. You didn't realize you had alters. Obviously, it's kind of not like in the Hollywood movies where everybody tells when you're dramatically switching personalities, right? So this kind of, it's not the way that often the picture is painted. You don't know what's happening inside of you at this point.
I don't know what's happening. I have no idea. In fact, I'm continuing to be a mother, but I'm also have taken a job as a teacher, and am very effective at that. And I go to work every day, and parents want their children in my classroom. And then I go home and I roll up into a ball because I don't know what's happening to me. It is, I call it one big dissociative bubble. Prior to my diagnosis, I lived in one big dissociative bubble. I did not know what was happening to me. Now, maybe when we talk a little bit further along, Linda, I'll explain after the diagnosis that I was able to separate triggers. But in a sense, this is what my initial memories were. My initial memories were just trigger upon trigger upon trigger. Now, some people in our audience may not know what a trigger is, and it's really often just a little simple, innocent thing that happens to you today that reminds you of something awful that had happened to you in the past. And if you can't remember what happened to you in the past, you can't even connect it that way. So you're just there. And I would say every pore of my skin would throb constantly in pain. And I didn't know why. It was and then of course I had all the mind things going on, and the feeling unreal. I used to say that I felt, or I wrote in my journal that I felt like I was in the corner, in the ceiling, in the corner, looking down on this wretched woman who was going through life. And of course, the wretched woman was me, but I wasn't even connected to me. I was looking at myself from up on the ceiling, you know. So that sense of unreality is a part of dissociative identity disorder too.
Yeah, so these are some of the symptoms you're experiencing internally while you're in this yellow brick house. And how did you notice that something was really wrong because these symptoms wouldn't stop? And then what was the catalyst for kind of breaking open your system? So you began to understand a little bit more, although it was still very confusing and in this big dissociative ball. that something was happening to you that you could not understand?
Yeah, so all of this was happening while my family was still intact. And I would also note that my children were starting to have some real issues, and I was having a very difficult time connecting them with them and helping them through their issues. You know, my husband was getting his PhD. He was working really hard, and he was never around. He was never at home. And I was dealing with all 4 children and all the other issues. Plus my insides were going crazy, and I didn't know what all this meant. And then I discovered that he was having an affair, and he had been having an affair for 2 years. This was a really a trigger par excellence, you know, because it mimicked the original betrayal. It was the person that you put all your trust in was betraying me. And of course, that was that's a whole story in itself that I won't take up tonight. But that too contributed to the challenges that I was experiencing at the time, because he was quite angry at me because I wouldn't reconcile with him. And so it became my fault that he had been having an affair. And so it was a little crazy making in my mind, and it fit right into the kinds of crazy making that people who have DID or any survivor probably has to deal with, because people often deny and divert and you know, try to make us see things differently than we really know in our gut. And so that was certainly happening to me at that time. So that was the catalyst that split my whole system apart. Prior to that, I can look back now and I know my parts were there, and I know in many cases who was doing what and saying what, but at the time I did not know that. But when this happened, I just broke loose. But I still wasn't diagnosed, so I still didn't have any idea what was going on in my mind when there were like 10 voices at a time. So.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how that would be such a huge trigger, because it's such a parallel to what happens, particularly during childhood sexual trauma, and that there's this huge betrayal of trust, usually by someone in your family or extended circle. And if it is discovered, or sometimes even if it's not, you are blamed for the abuse itself. You know, somehow it becomes your fault. So I can see that that would have really kind of shattered any kind of defenses you had. That must have been such a hard and difficult time.
It was an incredibly hard time. There was a period of about 10 years. It was, you know, the 6 years leading up to this, and then the 6 years after that. I was functioning and I was out there, and I was a teacher. I went back to school. I became a principal, all that. You would have met me and thought I was a lovely person, that I was doing such a good job. But inwardly, it was, I was holding on by my fingernails.
Yeah, so you didn't really have concrete memories at this time, correct, of what had happened to you? But when you say that, I don't know that everybody who hasn't experienced it or been close to survivors really understands, what does it mean to not have concrete memories? You know, what kind of memories did you have if they weren't concrete?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you that the kind of memory that I wanted was a memory that I could take to the bank, where I could tell you what dress I was wearing and what the wallpaper looked like and who did what and when and where, and I could place it within the context of my total life, and that there was no question about it. And I wanted that because I felt so crazy. I wanted to know that there was a reason for my being crazy, you know. But that's not what I had. And I would just explain that, and it's taken me a long time to understand this myself. And I thank my therapist, Sonia, who I believe is here today. And I also thank people like Bessel van der Kolk and Janina Fisher and people like that who have written about this so that I could learn. But it has to do with how the brain operates. So if an event happens to you, or if you witness an event, what happens is the brain takes it in through the back brain, and the back brain decides whether it's dangerous or whether it's safe. And if it's safe, it just goes right up to the front brain where your cognitive brain works. And it's processed there, it's stored, and you remember it. Of course, we all know that memory is unreliable. And so that memory, it is true, it's not true, we never know. But it's come through the root of the back brain. But when you're experiencing trauma, it comes through the back brain and it never gets to the front brain, because the back brain sends it right back out into the body in a fight, flight, or freeze response to save yourself from whatever it is. And that's true in any circumstance. That's true for rape victims. It's true for soldiers in war. It's true for any kind of traumatic experience where you perceive that your life is being threatened. So what happens is then maybe some of that memory gets up to the front brain, but a lot of it doesn't, and it just goes back out into the body. And that's why Bessel van der Kolk, who some of you know about, and you've already mentioned him, he's a very well-known researcher in this area. And he says the body keeps the score, because our body, the memories we have in our body are more reliable even the memories that we have in our mind, because they don't change. They're sort of frozen when they're in our body. I do want to read something that a clinician and researcher, Janina Fisher, wrote that was really meaningful to me. She said, many survivors say, I don't remember anything, without realizing they are remembering when they suddenly startle, feel afraid, tighten up, pull back, feel shame or self-hatred, or start to tremble. So these are memories, and they sometimes come along with full-fledged cognitive memories, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they come with fragments, snippets, overwhelmed emotions, body pain. I did eventually, over time, have memories, but they never felt real to me. They always felt very distant, like they really didn't belong to me, and like these were just stories. They weren't real. So that's sort of traumatic memory 101 that I can explain to you.
I think that's so helpful, and especially, for survivors out there who are listening, sometimes you can spend decades of your life desperately searching for that kind of cognitive memory that we think is that gold standard. We have to have that, and we still have yet to fully understand that our body is speaking to us, and that traumatic memories are processed and stored in a different way. And it is creative and brilliant for a child to be able to have this dissociative mechanism, because otherwise that child might not survive with any kind of intactness, I think. So it's a creative and brilliant way of surviving. Although when you start to deal with it then in adult life, I know during this period in this yellow brick house, you also attempted suicide. You attempted suicide. Are you able to talk a little bit? Can you tell us anything about that time?
Sure, I can. First of all, I want to say that I believe, and I don't want to talk for all people with DID, but I do not think it's uncommon for people with DID to have suicidal ideation, because there's so much craziness going on that there are times when we wonder if we can continue. So in my case, as I've already described a little bit, I was just so overwhelmed with these powerful emotions that were coming from nowhere, and with this excruciating body pain. and these multiple voices in my head that I just thought I just and there was a particular incident that happened with one of my children where I thought, I'm such a terrible mother. You know, they would be better off without me. You know, and I would write in my journal and say, well, of course it would be better they need their mother, you know, but not the way I am now. And I've been trying for 6 years, and I've been doing this and that and the other thing, and nothing works. There's just no help. There's no help. And so they'd be better off without me. And that's really how I felt. And I overdosed. And as I was laying down on the couch and slipping away, all of a sudden, boom, a part of me said, I don't want to die. What's this all about? And ran to the phone, called a friend who took me to the hospital, who pumped the substance out of me, sent me back home. And then I went back and then I went back into the classroom on Monday, you know, because I said, well, I'm a teacher, but also because I'm a multiple, you know, you have another part that can take over. And that's what I gradually learned was happening to me is I had parts that could go into the classroom. I had parts that could manage this crisis and parts that could manage that crisis. But then I had parts that were just rolling up into a bowl, into a fetal position. So, yeah, that was and I would say also, so after that happened, I have one part that said, I am so glad to be alive. We're going to seize the day. I'm going to live until I die, you know? And then another part said, you are so pathetic. You couldn't even commit suicide, right? What a wimp, you know? So I had these two kinds of voices working at me, you know? I was always working back and forth between them, really.
Oh my gosh. Oh, man. So I am glad you had parts.
There's a happy ending. So I just want to say that now we're halfway through. Yes. If you can all hang in there, there's definitely a happy ending, but go ahead.
So, you know, this kind of brings up the next thing I wanted to talk to you about. So you have these various parts, and some of them are very professional. You are in a place where you're experiencing these kind of symptoms. Your marriage has fallen apart, finances are rough, you're in an educational career, you're a teacher, and there's one of your elders that really connects with kids. The kids love her, and she loves these kids in the classroom, but yet at the same time, suddenly you almost can't connect with your own children. They feel, I think you write, they're almost like strangers. Like you look at these children and say, who are these children? I don't know these children. So was there an elder involved in caring for your children and a different one in the classroom? What was happening here? And I can't imagine how difficult that would be for your children as well as for you.
Yes, it was very difficult for them and for me. And yes, there was an altar involved in that. I want to say that what I'm going to explain to you now is not something I knew in the moment. I didn't understand this until years later, as I was piecing all of this together.
Yeah.
But the part of me that I identified with, who raised my children and loved them, I think she was given birth the same time that my first son was given birth, but she just like came on the scene and just loved them with all her heart and loved my husband and just loved, you know, keeping a family together. It was all of who I was. It was all of who she was. I really didn't know she existed until she disappeared. And she disappeared because there was danger, because the family home was filled with triggers and she could not stay. I'll say prior to that time, she also was the person who went into education. She thought, oh, I love children so much and I'm so good with them. I can become a teacher. So I went back to school. I became a teacher. And I had another alter who was really the brain part of me. She was the professional part, and her name was Paula. So Paula and Laura, you know, usually managed the teaching. So even after Laura disappeared at home, she would still show up in teaching because it wasn't as unsafe there. It was a safer environment. So and Paula also combined with other alters, which I won't go into right now, but sadly that helped me through my teaching responsibilities. It did not help me in my home life because while Laura was gone, I was left trying. I knew I loved my children, but I had lost all the feeling. And then I had Rosie, the little part of me who was crying, and I had Sylvia who wanted to go dancing, and I had Mike, who was the angry one who wanted to, like take on the world. And so I had all these different parts wanting to do different things. And I was just trying to figure out how to raise my children, how to feel that love again. So it was incredibly difficult for me and for them. And I want to say that for the most part, they're very resilient and they've come through. And they, I think they've forgiven me, they love me. I know that. So good.
So during this time, you still don't have a diagnosis, but you do admit yourself to the women's unit of a psychiatric hospital because you're desperate. You do not understand what is happening. I don't know who could understand from the inside what's happening. Was that helpful? Can you tell us any more about that time you spent in the women's unit, but you weren't diagnosed yet, right?
No, I was not diagnosed. And
Right.
I was right on the verge of another suicide attempt. And that's why I went into the women's unit. It was the women's unit at Northwestern Institute in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania. It is no longer in existence, and I'm sorry about that. I do understand that hospitalization for many people, especially folks with DID, can be really awful, and that there are many programs that are not helpful at all. But this was wonderful. Now, again, I had no diagnosis, but the women's unit worked out of a health model rather than a medical model. And so instead of asking what's wrong with you when you check in, they ask, well, what happened to you to put you in the position you're in right now? So they were really trying to dig under the surface to find out what are the underlying reasons that you're having these kinds of issues. So I was there for 30 days. And what happened is when you, at least in my case, when I went into the hospital, everything quieted down. It was safe there. I didn't have the constant internal chatter. I didn't have the constant triggers. And so in that safety, I could learn things. And they had art therapy and music therapy. They had motivational 12-step lectures. They had community meetings. And so it became a really wonderful place for me to be. I knew when I left that that it wouldn't last. I mean, I knew it wasn't going to last, but I thought at least I can take this time to do as much work as I can do. So for me, and in that particular institution, that was a really wonderful step. I think everyone has to look at what's available to them as to whether hospitalization is helpful or not.
And if I recall, that institute at Northwest was one of the early sanctuary models. They called it sanctuary, and it was one of the very first kind of what we call it a trauma-informed units. And we're still struggling. There are so many hospitals and medical centers that are still light years from where they were. Which kind of leads me to my next question. So when were you finally diagnosed with DID? And when you were, what was the therapy like?
Well, I was at the hospital in 1991 and discharged after 30 days. And then my ex-husband and I made some changes in our living arrangements with our children. And I got a new job that was not going to be quite as intense as the previous position. And I moved to a new city, found a new apartment. My youngest son came with me, and I started to look for a therapist. I worked with Sonia for about a year before I decided that I needed a second opinion, because Sonia and I talked about these parts, you know, and back then it was called multiple personality disorder. And I said, do you think I'm multiple, Sonia? And she said, well, yeah. Or do you believe that's even possible? Do you believe in multiplicity? And she said, yes, I believe in it. And I think that you are multiple, but the important thing is, what do you think? And so I said, well, I don't know. And I went to a psychiatrist that was affiliated with Northwestern at the time, and visited him and was assessed and evaluated, and he confirmed the diagnosis. So having a diagnosis, for me at least, was actually a bit freeing. It was complicated, and actually I didn't believe it. It's really unbelievable, you know, and most of us feel that way. This can't be true. But it explained a little bit about what was going on with me. I always saw myself as a smart person, as a rational person, as a competent person who could manage things. And all that went out the window. And I was really struggling to find some reason why this was happening. So once I received the diagnosis, it didn't make it easier, but it did, because there was a whole lot of work to do then. But at least it gave me a path to go on. It was something I could hang my hat on then, as I was moving forward in the next many years.
Yeah, and it gave you some kind of name and framework
Yeah.
for what was going on. So could you just briefly describe what it's like then to be in treatment, just so other people that may also be highly dissociative or undiagnosed with DID could have some idea? Did your different parts, were they able to like safely interact with the therapist, or how did that all work?
Okay, so I first of all, I'm not an expert in all the different kinds of therapies that are out there. So I want to make sure that anything I say, you understand this is what my experience has been. And there may be other factors or important pieces that are missing in my story that might be present in someone else's story. But in my story, what I would say is that the most important aspects of a therapist and therapy is to have someone who will listen to you very deeply, someone who will believe your stories even when you don't believe them yourself. That's critical. And I am quite sure that I am speaking for almost everyone who is multiple, that we don't believe our stories. You know, we just don't. That's a part of the disorder. I want to just sneak this in, that the brain does this in order to protect the child, so the child can go back out into the real world and not remember the trauma. So there are other parts that hold the trauma. And if the child is out with a caregiver, and the caregiver is the person who abused them, it's actually functional for the child not to know that, because the child has to continue to trust that person in order to survive. This idea of being believed is so important, because DID is the hidden disorder where we often don't believe ourselves. The other thing that I think was really important for my therapy was that Sonia would always welcome them when they came, even the ones who were really mean and ready to chop her head off, you know? I mean, I could come in like really, really angry, you know, and I'd go on and on and on and on, and she'd say, well, welcome, I'm so glad you're here. Every single time, every time she would welcome my alters and say, I'm so glad you're here. And this is why she did that, or at least I think this is why she did this, is because our altars are all hurt children. In some way or another, they're hurt children, and they have taken on these parts to protect us.
Yeah.
And so when you welcome them, then they start to develop some trust. And if you listen to them, then maybe they'll begin to tell you their stories. And it takes a long time. Trust doesn't come quickly. But Sonia built a relationship with my altars. And as she did that, then they were willing to talk to her.
Well, I know that you had kind of a whole system of altars, and you've shared some of their names and some of their functions before. But I'd like to, if you could tell us just a little bit more about kind of how you met some of the key ones and what their specific role is, especially Rosie. She's like this core kind of child that really experienced, was formed to protect her from experience a lot. Can you tell us something about Rosie and what Rosie represented and what Rosie remembered or was afraid of?
So after I came out of the hospital and before I started my new job and before I had a new therapist, I would, vacillate from jumping up and going and getting my classroom ready to just laying in the bed and disappearing. And I had a twilight dream, and the twilight dream spoke to me and said, "You have a twin sister, but she is me." And they gave her away, and her name is Rosie. I had no idea what that meant, but I wrote it down. And it was only over the next year or so that I began to realize that I met Rosie and would meet Rosie in other dreams and in my journal and in therapy. And she was about 2 or 3 years old. I'm not going to describe, some of the stories that she told. But she was really the central part of my system. And the word system is what we use to describe all the different altars that we have and how they function with one another. So I met other altars in different ways. Sometimes I met them in dreams, and sometimes I met them in my journal writing, and sometimes I met them in therapy. And sometimes I met them just in real life. So I'll just name, I had, in my memoir, I have introduced 12 of my altars. I consider them foundational altars, but I probably had well over 20 when you count the fragments. So some of the important names and functions are Rosie, the really hurt child Nanny, who was the full-time caregiver. So when Rosie was abused, Nanny took the pain, and she had to take care of Rosie, and so she was always exhausted. Mike was very angry, but he was wonderful. In the end, once we tamed his anger, he was the one who really pushed me towards healing. Sylvia was his teenage twin, and she was the altar who held my sexuality and my sensuality. Laura, I've already described, is the one who just adored my children. Devil held what was really he started out as an organ in the middle of my body, and he just pumped shame throughout my body. He turned out to be a hurt child too, and was actually Rosie's dark side altar. And Protector, who is godlike, and he actually told me that he created all of the other altars because he knew I needed help. But there were others as well. But when I would diagram them, I did different diagrams at different points in time, and they all turned out, I realized there was a ring around Rosie. So the system name is the Ring Around Rosie. And I don't know how many of you know that little jingle, but ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. I remember that from childhood. So that is where that came from.
Wow. Just what you shared, just I think helps us understand the formidable need for such a complex defense system, that there would be so many different alters created in order to hold different pieces of what is happening and to protect that core little child, in this case, Rosie, we identified. It's incredibly complex what we human beings can do, especially a child who is suffering repeated trauma. And just thinking about, no, you were in touch somewhat with your parents during this journey and during your healing. What was your relationship like with them as you went through this process?
When I came out of the hospital, I loved my parents. And I thought they loved me, and I thought they would support me. I had discovered in the hospital that most of the other women there who had been abused in some way or another. And I also noticed that I was very much like them, but I didn't have these, memories. And so I that summer I visited them, and I asked them very sincerely and innocently. I said, naively, I guess is the word, is there anybody that who might have hurt me? Because it seems like, maybe I might have been hurt, and that's why some of these things are coming up. Mm-hmm. Well, that was like a really, I never expected the response. It was just like, boom. The wall went down, the defenses went up, and I realized I was never allowed to speak about that again. And I didn't. I never spoke about that to them again. However, I started getting envelopes from my father in the mail with articles about false memory syndrome on a regular basis. He wouldn't put any notes or anything. And I kept thinking, well, I didn't say anything to him about abuse. I wasn't accusing him of anything. Why is he sending these things to me? But he was. I also skipped a part that when I was in the hospital, he wrote a letter to my psychiatrist, and he told her that he said, I don't believe in shrinks, but she's under your care, so I'm writing you. Just don't go into the hobgoblins of the past, and don't tell her that I wrote you. And so she immediately told me, that he had written me and gave me the letter. But he worked really hard to keep me from going into the past. Again, I never accused him or anyone in my family of anything. But I was eventually disowned. And so I won't go into that whole story, but I would just say that I realized that this was for real when they invited my ex-husband for Thanksgiving dinner, and they didn't invite me. And so after that, for years, my children and my mother and my father and my ex-husband would have holidays with each other, and I would not be with them. And that was a mix. That was actually, in the end, it sounds very painful, and it was, but I would say that I was actually grateful, because I just had to get out of the toxic family situation to do the inner work. And it was so much easier to do it without them in my life than it was to do it with them in my life.
Yes. And I'm sure, there are survivors listening. Many of them have had these kind of experiences in trying to talk to families of origin about childhood trauma, and it's painful. To be separated from your birth family, but sometimes it is the only way to, as you say, kind of continue to heal and not be in that toxic environment. But it hurts. It's another betrayal, and it hurts. Wow, I have so much more I want to ask you, and I know we'll be not too long before we open it up to questions. But I do really want to find out, when I got to first know you, you were in seminary, and then I knew you when you were a pastor here in Lancaster County. I visited you up in New England. And I know you're a woman of great faith, right? And yet you're coming from this family of, a father who's an atheist, a mother who's agnostic. You've had a career in teaching, you were a principal. So tell me something about how faith played a role, not only in your becoming a pastor, but throughout your healing. Was there a role for faith as you healed, or what was that?
Yes, it was a huge role for me. And it's quite a story and quite a important story, and there's no time to go into it tonight, but I can say that through this whole period, it's really about a 20-year period. I went from no faith to tentative faith, to committed faith, and then to vocational faith. And I understand God perhaps differently from the traditional classical theology, but I have experienced that presence within me and around me. And so that's all I need to know. I also want to say that by the grace of God, and I say that with all due respect for people anywhere they are on their spiritual journeys, and including those who are atheists and have good reason to be, that we're everywhere. And the faith that I have says we are exactly where we're supposed to be. And so I don't want this to sound as if I'm trying to promote my own journey here. But it's through all of this that I eventually was able to integrate. And that was 20 years ago. So let's see, it would have been about 2000, about the year 2000. It was before I went to seminary. And for me, that was exactly what was right. That my parts remembered being all together, and they wanted to be back together again. And so they're still there. They'll always be there somewhere. And every now and then one breaks off and says something to me, but we function as one now. And that is just a great blessing for me. At the same time, I also want to say that there are many people with DID who are able to heal the symptoms of abuse and trauma and dissociation. They're able to heal that, but they want to remain in parts. And that's a valid choice. We call that, I can't remember what we call that, but it's harmonious and collaborative parts, functional multiplicity. I think that's the word for it. And so the end of my story is not necessarily the end of someone else's story. But for me, that was a gift. And I am so grateful. I'm so grateful that I did not follow through on my suicidal ideation. I'm so grateful that I kept plugging forward, and so grateful for the character traits of my parts who pushed me forward in different ways and picked up pieces for me that I couldn't pick up as a unified person, but they could pick them up separately. So grateful they were willing to talk to each other and talk with me and collaborate. So grateful for the therapy that I received. And I'm really happy. And I didn't think I would be happy again. I wanted to be happy, whatever that means, I guess happiness is really just a sense of peace. That's what it is. And I'm at peace, and I'm grateful for that. So I want to make sure that for all of the journey that I have walked, which has been excruciating, that I'm just grateful that I'm where I am now. And to be able to talk with you, Linda.
I just I sit here and I just remember, our relationship and getting to know you and feeling your deep spirituality. and you knew I was a survivor because my book, The Deepest Wound, had recently come out, and you saw it in the Cokesbury bookstore at Lancaster Seminary, and we forged a relationship. And I am just so thrilled that you are publishing a story and sharing your story. And before we open it up to questions and comments from our listeners, I do want to make sure that everyone knows that they can sign up on your website to be notified, right? As soon as Zoomer More is published. And that website, and I think Andrea has put it in the chat box here, is www.lynbarrett.com, LYNBARRETT. So they can be notified. There's a beautifully illustrated ebook people can now download for free on your website, and it's called DID Unpacked, a Parable. And it's a wonderful book, and I would encourage everybody who's listening to go to the website and download it. But you're doing much more than just writing, Lyn. I wonder if you could briefly share what else you're up to as you kind of bring this passion for life and healing to your work as now an advocate for people with DID. Could you share a little bit about that? And then Andrea will come in and moderate some questions or comments for us.
Well, yes, I sort of accidentally found a wonderful thing to do, and that is to invite other people with dissociative disorders into writers' workshops. And some of the people that are in the writers' workshops that I hold are here tonight. We meet every other week. I have two, one that goes in the afternoon and one in the evening. And I just want to say that it is a real honor and awe-inspiring for me to work with these women and men who come to workshop, who are amazing writers of different kinds of writing, not all the same. Now I have to admit that people like me who have DID were not known for our ability to trust real easily. And yet these people are coming and they trust me to lead the workshop. They trust each other with their writing, giving feedback, and they're trusting themselves. And I have just been blown away by that. So that's been at least as much of a gift for me as I hope it's been for them. Writers' workshops, you can find out about that on my website. We welcome new people all the time. We're starting up a memoir writing class next September. And I write a weekly blog and send out a weekly newsletter. And, you know, it's everybody's got their own gifts, and my gift is to be able to share some kind of reflection on what it's like to live and heal with DID. So, and that's pretty much what I'm doing. My memoir is going to be published on December 1st. And I'm sure we'll be putting out more information about that as time goes on. And, you know, hope that some of you will want to read it. So I don't know, am I doing anything else, Linda? I can't remember. I think that's enough for right now.
Yeah, that's, I just am so in awe of your healing and what you are doing now as you reach out to other people. I want to thank you for being here with us tonight and sharing this conversation between you and me with all of these other folks. And thank you so much for the work you're doing and the gifts you're offering to the world. The world sorely needs your gifts.
Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity, Linda, and thank you for all the gifts that you're giving the world too.
Thank you. Andrea, I'll turn it over to you so people can ask some questions or make some comments.
Sure. And while you all continue to put questions in the chat, I am going to share the slide again with Lyn's website information. And I am also going to put in the link about the day retreat for survivors that I had mentioned. And I am also going to shamelessly plug the link where you can donate to Safe Communities. We appreciate all support and indeed depend on it as well. I'm going to choose a few questions here and hopefully we'll be able to get to most of them. Lyn, you had mentioned how living with dissociative identity disorder often involves amnesia at some times, and sometimes what some people call losing time. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I was mostly co-conscious, and that means that the amnesic barriers between most of my alders was very minor. I did have some alders that didn't know about each other, but I, as the host, was conscious of their presence, even if I didn't know who they were or what was happening. I was amnesic for the traumatic memories, and I was amnesic for large pieces of my childhood. Many people have amnesia between alters, and that's a challenge of its own because as someone has recently said, where the heck did I go? You know, and then developing communication between alters can be more challenging. But the best way to do that, the best way to begin to develop communication between alters, which will then consequently lower amnesic barriers, is to write. You know, to write and leave messages to your alters, and have your alters leave messages to you or between each other. And it takes a long time to develop that. You can't just tell them, well, write. But if you create a safe environment, I actually wrote love letters to my alters. And I don't know exactly why I did that, but I guess I just felt like I needed to be loved, you know. And I say, I don't even know who you are or what's going on, but I love you, you know. And I think that that's hard sometimes for people to do, because sometimes the alters can really create havoc in their lives. And so you don't feel a whole lot of love. You can feel anger, and you can feel frustration and confusion. But if we remember that even these difficult ones saved our lives. And if we can just remember that, then we can begin to give them a little bit of love as well as we can. You know, we can't force anything, but we have to sort of create the environment where the love between alters can begin to grow.
Thank you. Can you talk about you are experiencing and hearing and talking internally? What are people around you experiencing? One person asked, do the alters always change you, voice and mannerisms when they show up, or can they just use you to express their feelings and opinions?
Well, both of those are true. But I would say that 95% of all people with DID are covert, which means that you can't see a big difference between alters. Unless you are very intimate with that person, you're not likely to notice the difference. Remember, DID is the hidden disorder. Your body created it to hide the abuse from you and from everyone else. And so the desire to remain hidden is so deeply ingrained that we usually do everything we can to not demonstrate our differences to other people. Having said that, there are certainly people who do, change hairstyles and change voices and so on and so forth, but that's the exception, not the rule.
Okay, thank you. What are ways a survivor with DID can get to know and work with their parts alters?
Well, I think I already mentioned writing is probably the most important because it will eventually build the communication and relationship between each other and you and each of them, and with your therapist. I'm not sure what else I want to say about that. I'm sure there are other ways to do it, Andrea, but I think for me, building a relationship with my therapist and having my parts willing to come forward and speak to her was important, but it's also really important to have them come forward and speak to me. And that happened by writing and telling them that I love them and listening to them. And honestly, I didn't believe them, but I did. I would tell them, that was the sort of crazy making aspect of it, is that of course I believe you, but there's part of me saying, no, I don't believe you, but I believe you. And it's, I think that's so important for multiples is to believe yourself even when you don't believe it. And I think that sends a huge message to your parts that she believes me, even when she can't believe it, she believes me.
Thank you. Yeah, that really stood out to me when you talked about how those were the two things that you needed from your therapist, was deep listening and belief, even when you didn't believe yourself. How does this relate to internal family systems and the parts work that is done there?
That's a great question. And I just learned about internal family systems recently, and I really don't know a whole lot about it. So what I say here could be totally wrong. But I think there are probably some great connections and overlaps. But I'm not certain that internal family systems, what internal family systems it says, I think, is that we all have internal family systems, that we all have different parts. And in reality, that's true. We do all have different parts. But I don't think we all have different parts that were created out of trauma. And so I'm not sure where that diverges with IFS. But I'm sure that there are probably some strategies that are good crossovers and connections. But it's really important to remember that in DID, the parts were created from chronic, horrible trauma.
Thank you. There are some very supportive comments that I'll just read before we go to the next question. Thank you for your courage and for generously sharing your story. And then they asked, when you were initially diagnosed, how did you get past the shock and disbelief?
That's a good question, but I was relieved.
Mm.
I was just relieved because I had all this craziness going on in my head, and it was like, okay, so now I know this is what it is. Now, not everybody is like me. I think it can be a horrible shock for people, and it can be very distressing for quite a while. And, we just have to be gentle with ourselves. And be gentle with our parts, even if we don't believe in them. it's for those of you who are religious out there, this is a matter of faith, it really, so if just be gentle with yourself, and it's okay to be upset, because it's all very, very upsetting. But ultimately, when we can start to love our parts, that means we're starting to love ourselves.
Mm.
And when we can love ourselves, that's when we heal.
Let's write that down. When we love ourselves, that's when we can heal. Thank you. Can you give us a rough idea of what the timeline looked like from the time you received your diagnosis and began to unpack all of this? How long it took to build that safe relationship with your therapist, and between parts, lower walls of dissociation and communication with an understanding of your parts to finally be able to integrate, just in terms of years between each of those pieces?
Well, you realize you're asking this question of a multiple who has problems with timelines. When I was writing my memoir, I had to actually bring up a separate document that was where I wrote my timeline. I have to go refer to it again and again. So I'm going to do the best I can with this. It was about 10 years from the time I first started falling apart until I went into the hospital.
Wow.
81 to 91. Now, it was slow, in 81, I wasn't all apart then, now my marriage was still together and all that, but it was kind of slow. But over that time, I started to take antidepressants, and, which did me no good at all. And then I attempted suicide. I found out my husband was having an affair. My family was falling apart. I was falling apart. I went into the hospital in 1991. And then I came out, and I was stabilized enough. I started this new job, and then I found a new therapist. Was diagnosed the next year in 1992. And I want to say that I integrated very naturally and organically without any effort on my part. It just happened about 10 years later.
Okay. And when you say naturally and without any work on your part, I mean, it seems like your process of choosing to get to know and love them would go towards that.
Well,
right?
It was hard work. I mean, it was excruciatingly hard work for 10 years, but I wasn't working to integrate. I was working to heal. I was, the work was to heal. And that's really the work we should all be doing, is to heal. And for me, integration was natural and organic. For others, as I've already mentioned, they may choose functional multiplicity. But once you've healed, you could make either of those choices, because you are, because you're okay, you're good.
Thank you. Some more appreciative comments. Thank you, Lynn. What a gift for you to share your journey with us. Bless you. This person asked whether this would be a correct way to sum up DID, the body and mind's way of coping with trauma until you were in a place to handle the trauma.
Well, that's a good way of putting it. Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
This person would like you to say more about the role of faith in your healing. And I know you were reluctant because you don't want participants to feel that they need to go one way or another, but is there anything else you could say about how it was helpful for you?
Yeah, I guess I was also mindful of time, but I was able to enter into faith as a Quaker. And the way that happened is I was hired to help start a Quaker school. So I was the first teacher of a Quaker school. We had 15 students from kindergarten to third grade in my first class. And by the time I left, we had our own building and 150 students. So,
Awesome.
yeah. And Quakers, that's a very gentle way to enter into faith, because you sit in Quaker meeting for an hour of meditative silence, and that was so healing for me. And the Quaker understanding of God is that there's that of God in every person. And I was really able to embrace that even before I believed in God. You know, I still didn't believe in God, but I could sit in a classroom filled with children and look them in the eye and say, there's that of God in you, you know, every one of you. And that was easy for me, you know, and I remember thinking, well, I don't really believe in God, but I can say that and it feels truthful. You know, so it was a gradual growth on my part. And eventually I will always treasure my Quaker roots. And there are aspects of that that are still fully and completely in me. But at some point I wanted to experience a more structured worship. And so I had also moved, and I was pretty far away from the Quaker meeting. And so I started to go to a United Church of Christ church, which is the church that I then continued to until this day. But I would also say that this is how I actually came to faith. I was feeling that faith, but I couldn't accept it. It was sort of like believing in multiplicity. You don't, you know, it's like, I know I'm a multiple. I know I have parts, but I don't believe any of this. It can't be true. And that's where I was in faith as well. And I was still at the Quaker school, and I had become the head of the school. And I was at a conference with and was meeting with a mentor, and we were walking around on a spring day on a college campus. And we talked about this, and I said, Paul, you know, I really want to believe in God, but I just can't. And he said, well, you know, Quakers, you don't have to say you believe in God. You can say you believe in the light, or, you know, the divine presence. And I said, well, that's not what I want to say. I want to say I believe in God. And he said, well, Lynn, it sounds like you don't want to disappoint your father. Now, this is before, you know, there was any rift in the family. And I just laughed, and I say, oh, I disappoint my father all the time. And then he walked away, and I sat down under this big tree on a college campus. And like this, I just started sobbing, and this wall inside of me just came tumbling down. And it's like, I realized that my father had built that wall inside of me, and that it was now gone, and that I could believe in God if I wanted to. And so I just embraced it. And so that's that story. And again, everybody's story, faith story is different, or lack of faith story. Some people here may have been hurt by the church. And so that's a very different kind of journey than the journey that I had. And I think we need to honor all of those journeys. And wherever we are, I don't even want to call it a continuum. It's like a mosaic. Wherever we are spiritually is where we're supposed to be. And that doesn't mean we're not going to grow and change and go somewhere else on it. But I really believe that truly from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to see, I know there's one I want to wrap up with, and I'm going to see if I miss any others. Thank you so much. It's so nice to be a part of this. Lyn is amazing. So thankful to know her. Okay, I'm going to ask this question, and then I think maybe there's something you might read from your book as a closing.
Oh, okay.
If I remember it. Okay, so the question is, what do you see as ways and venues a survivor can regain their voice and help other survivors?
Wow, what a wonderful question. I guess I would just say the first thing that we all have to do is heal. And I'm not holding that out as some goal. I'm holding that out as a life journey. And we're never finished healing, right? And we're all of us, you know, are going to be healing. Whether we've had a wonderful family life or a terrible family life, we're all going to be healing until we die. So it's a life journey. And that's the most important thing. And then just look inside yourself and see what it is that you've been given that you can give back.
Mm.
And so for Linda, for instance, she has had this wonderful commitment to safe churches and safe communities. And she's just an outstanding organizer and director, and so deeply inspirational. And that was her gift. You know, it was something that was given to her and she gave it back. You know, my gift, I guess I'm still learning it. I've been trying to give my gifts back all throughout my life, but right now I never thought I'd be, you know, leading writers' workshops for people with dissociative disorders, but it's giving back to me as much as it's, you know, giving to others. It doesn't have to be big. It can be small. It can just be reaching your hand out to someone. It could be volunteering for an organization like Safe Communities or another organization in your community. It could be coming to writers' workshop and you know, doing a little bit of writing and seeing where that takes you, because maybe it'll take you someplace that will help someone else sometime. But most likely it's something I haven't even mentioned because, you know, you all have gifts that I don't know about. And, you know, but if you want to give back, if that's your intention, just be open to it. And I think it'll come to you eventually.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I just want to say, all these people who are saying such nice things about me, thank you. But, you know, you all are the heroes. You're here listening to my story. I'm so grateful that you've come. And again, each one of you is on your own healing path, and each one of you has gifts to give back. So maybe we're all a community of heroes, right?
That's right.
Thank you.
So why don't we close with the selection from your book?
Oh, that's right. I forgot. Let's find it. So I actually wrote this at the end of my last year of seminary. And it's called Pebble Over Time. And this actually is a poem. A lot of my poems were just garbled in my journal, but this I wrote as a poem. There are pebbles at the beach that are as smooth as ice. They tell me that the polished, glassy surface of these rocks was pounded out of their own ragged edges by the tumultuous weight of the raging ocean over eons of time. Rolling along the depths of the ocean floor, caught up in the spiraling currents, tossed about in an underwater web of chaos, now and then riding the crest of the wave, then smashing against the saturated earth, not once, not twice, but so many times, so many cycles of abuse, of pain and horror, reliving, healing, breathing once again to produce this rosy gem, this pebble over time that cups within my hand. Get my hand up here as if I have a pebble. My hand protects this tiny stone, appreciates the wisdom trapped within this body, delights in the touch, the shape, the feel of the nugget, but can never take away the history or the polish, which is only the result of the pounding and the pain, and the pounding and the pain, and the pounding and the pain. And so to you, God, I offer this pebble over time, whose glow upon the beach reveals not the journey from whence it came. July 2004.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for being here this evening. It has been wonderful to hear about your journey, and thanks to each of you who were present. It is only with listeners that a storyteller can speak, and your presence and attention tonight is so appreciated. I wish you all a good night. And again, Lynn, thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night, everybody.
Night.
Thank you for being here.
Mm.